Good evening. Because I see that there's confusion about the subject, I want to go over the story of Arba and Nichnasu Pardes. Four people entered the Pardes. What is Pardes paradise? Paradise just means a garden. Which garden? The Garden of Eden. How can you enter the Garden of Eden if you live in the physical world and there's a separation? The answer is they did it through the Torah. They went into the depths of the Torah, and the Torah teaches you the source of everything, and they went into the source of everything till they reached the spiritual source that leads to divine knowledge. And divine knowledge doesn't mean that you can prognosticate. That's secondary. Prognostication is not prophecy. Although that's a sign that you're a prophet if you prognosticate accurately 100%. But the most important thing of prophecy is the knowledge of God. And what does it mean you know God? You understand the traits of God. You understand how things work and things are related. And you appreciate that. The four were not the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The four were not even the heads of the academy. They were the greatest, most precocious students of the academy. Rabbi Akiva, who was the greatest teacher of Israel, but he was not the head of the Sanhedrin, the High Court. The reason is because he was a Ben Gerim. His father was a convert, so he could not be the head of the High Court. The other three were students and colleagues. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, Rabbi Shimon ben Zoma, and Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya. They're called without the title Rebbe for various reasons. Elisha ben Avuya was a Tana, was a teacher, but he became a turncoat. Ben Azai and Ben Zoma died young. And because they died young, they are not remembered with an honorific title because most of the students remembered them as colleagues, not as teachers, even though they were the greatest minds of the generation. Elisha ben Avuya was the teacher of Rabbi Meir at the end of his life, and Rabbi Meir was the most brilliant of the students of Rabbi Akiva. So you have to understand that Elisha was superior to Rabbi Meir in his knowledge and perhaps even in his wisdom. Ben Zoma, it says, he who sees Ben Zoma, yitzap l'chochma, because Ben Zoma was the greatest of the students, the most erudite of the students. Ben Azai was the son-in-law temporarily of Rabbi Akiva, and therefore Rabbi Akiva did not take a slouch as his son-in-law. He left Rabbi Akiva's daughter almost immediately because he could not remain married, because he was married to the Torah. So these were the most erudite and devoted scholars of their day. And they entered Pardes. And what was the problem? There are two problems that I see immediately, maybe more. Number one, when you see godliness and you see the ways of God, it's hard to reorient the ways of God with what happens here in this world. It's enough, all the tragedies, all the murders, all the attacks, all the people who get sick, all the people who are maimed, injured, suffer emotional, physical, financial, emotional, family distress. Life is filled with all kinds of problems, and it becomes difficult for an ordinary person to see these problems and to think about God, that God orchestrates all of this and allows all these things to happen. The great Belzer Rebbe, Rabbeinu Aaron Rekeach of Belz, had 10 children. The children had approximately 100 or more grandchildren. He had 9 or 10 siblings. Of his entire family, only one younger brother survived, Rav Nachum, who was the Rav of Bilgerai, a town that's only a few miles away from my father's birthplace, Krasnobrod, Tamashov. It's like saying from Southfield to Birmingham. That's how far away it was. Bilgerai, little town. The Rav was the brother of the Belzer Rebbe. The Belzer Rebbe told his brother after the war to marry. His brother lived about a year and a half and gave birth to one son, the present Belzer Rebbe. So from the entire dynasty, from the entire illustrious family of the Belzer Rebbe, only one direct relative survived. And yet you never heard a peep. You never heard self-pity from the Belzer Rebbe. His whole focus was on the restoration of the Jewish community in general, and the Belzer Kehillah especially. Nothing else mattered. Restore the glory of Belz. Don't dwell on the pain and the suffering. How could a person be so stoic and strong? Because the Belzer Rebbe saw the other world. To him, reality wasn't just the framework of our bodies. He saw the world of neshamas, the world of souls, and the world of the future. And there was no contradiction between the pain and the suffering in this world and the goodness of God overall. Ben Azai went out of his mind when he examined the depths of the Torah, the depths of the knowledge of God. Ben Zoma died. Acher, Elisha ben Avuya, became an apostate. Only Rabbi Akiva entered with peace and left in a peaceful and a whole way. So there were two things: the knowledge of God and focusing on this knowledge of God in a world of tears, in a world of hurt. Focusing on the knowledge of God caused a spiritual desire on the part of Ben Zoma. He just didn't want to go on living in the physical world. So he died. He didn't die because his mind couldn't take it. He died because he felt such a warm rapture, such delight in the presence of God, that he questioned, why stay here? Why stay here in a world of hurt, in a world of falsehood, a world of doubt? He had no doubts, and he saw God, or godliness, completely revealed, and everything made sense. And there was only the one, there was only God's oneness that mattered. And he took it, and he went for it, and his soul left his body. Ben Azai was overwhelmed by the intricacy, by the incredible balance of nature, of the world, of God's traits, and what goes on in the world. The refinement of the process of thought, the balance of pleasure, pain, suffering, and reward, all are balanced and create a reality. And the thought process of that was so inspiring, so intricate, so mind-blowing, that he went out of his mind that there could be such thought process, such a deep thought process, such a true thought process. Elisha ben Avuya understood, but he had a problem. His problem was the Torah promises certain rewards. The Torah promises that if we follow the path and follow what God wants from us, we will be rewarded not just in the next world, but in this world. At least that's the implication. And he could not accept the deaths of 1 million Jews at the hands of the Romans. How we could look at that and say that God is merciful. And therefore, it had to be a mistake. That all this theory, all this thinking was irrational, and it couldn't be true. For if God was truly merciful, a truly merciful God, would never allow these things to happen. Rabbi Akiva, who was involved in the process of picking a Jewish king to fight the Romans, who encouraged his students to go to war, 24,000 of them, and they all died. How, which way, whether by sword or by plague, the Talmud says a plague could be a euphemism for a defeat in battle. Remember that the Romans saw every statement that was entered into the Talmud or into the tradition, and anything that was considered an affront to the government was removed. At any rate, he sent his students to battle, and he sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers. He was the spiritual guide to them, and they died in battle, fighting for Israel, but they died nonetheless. Men, women, children, killed in the process of a milchemes mitzvah, a holy war, to restore Jerusalem, to restore the temple, to restore the Davidic dynasty, the revelation of Mashiach. And he initiated that, and he encouraged that. And surely there might have been a doubt. He caused it. And yet he had no doubts. The God who promised us wondrous rewards for listening was the same God who allowed the defeat in battle for various reasons. Bar Kokhba wasn't fit. He sinned. And the people were all affected as a result. But it was a righteous cause. It was the right call. It just didn't work out. He did not lose heart. Because when you do something right and you die for a righteous cause, the world that comes after this one is a world of joy, a world of happiness, a world that's expansive. And he saw that. Nichnas b'sholim means that Rabbi Akiva entered whole with his eyes open. He knew that in battle you could lose, and you could lose your life, you could lose your limbs, you could lose an eye, you could lose a hand, you could lose a leg, you could wind up a cripple for the rest of your life. Your children could be taken from you. Horrific things happened to the women of Israel. Those are the chances, those are the scars of war. But were you supposed to go to war? The answer is yes. He had no doubts. And he also knew that it was possible that they would lose. And when they lost, he didn't lose himself, but immediately realized and saw that the souls that had been killed were on the highest levels of God's delight. Perhaps that's the reason why he allowed himself to be subjected to the most horrific type of pain and suffering. The Romans flayed his skin and muscles with iron combs, and he took it without complaining. They were scraping his muscle and tissue off of his body, and he was saying the Shema. Because to him, the spiritual reality was more real than the physical reality. He was not a man that didn't know reality. His feet were on the ground. He entered in peace, whole. He understood what the consequences might be and realized that no matter what, it was worth it. And therefore, he was going to prove through his own suffering that it was worth it. Elisha couldn't. To Elisha was a very sensitive soul. The pain and suffering of others overwhelmed him. And he could not correlate the spiritual gain over physical harm. It was impossible for him to accept. And he walked out. Didn't just walk out. He did horrific things for which he later had a change of heart. At the end of his life, he realized that the world is just transient, and the reality of the world to come is far greater, far more powerful, infinitely greater. And at that moment he cried out for having doubted that it was worthwhile. It didn't change the fact that he might have been the one that gave Rabbi Akiva to the Romans. The fact that he diverted many students from the study of Torah. Elisha believed that the Torah, if it came from God, had to bring you success in the physical world. And the problem with that, of course, is that God answers our prayers, but sometimes when God answers our prayers, the answer is no. For whatever reason, God sees fit. And Elisha couldn't understand it. Over the years, I haven't reconciled the things that Elisha did afterwards. But I can empathize with Elisha's perspective. Living with survivors of the Holocaust, seeing their pain, seeing their anguish, one can only imagine the horrors that they saw and that they had to live with all the rest of the days of their life. There's a book by Elie Wiesel. It's a short book. It's called Night. In that short book, Eli Wiesel, the Talmudic scholar, the Chassid of Vishnitz, the Chavrus of Menashe Klein, who became one of the greatest authorities on Jewish law of the past generation, Eli Wiesel, his heart was broken by what he saw. And maybe Eli Wiesel was the reincarnation of Elisha ben Avuya. I don't know. But just as I empathize with Eli Wiesel and the pain that he went through, there are people who criticize Eli for his pessimism, for the pain that he lived with. It wasn't a suffering that he was suffering. He suffered in the memory of all those who perished, that he saw perish. It wasn't that he suffered. It was that people suffered. And why should they suffer? Why should so many children, innocent babies, suffer such horrible deaths? And the question of Eli Wiesel is never resolved. It's just that in order to accept it, you have to be like Rabbi Akiva or like the Belzer Rebbe. And the answer, how can you have a resolution? There is no answer. So what do? The answer is you look forward. You don't look backwards, you look forward. The Belzer Rebbe did not see 100 grandchildren dead, 10 of his own children die, and his brothers and sisters dead. The Belzer Rebbe saw that there will be a shul in Yerushalayim that will be home to 5,000 and 10,000 chassidim davening together in the spirit of bells. He saw that there would be a future that would be glorious. He did not dwell on the past. And that's what it means that Rabbi Akiva nichnas b'sholim, v'yotze b'sholim. He realized that there are things that you cannot reconcile, that the possibility of pain and suffering exists. But we as creatures cannot stop. We have to build. And Rabbi Akiva built. And he didn't stop till the day that he died. Reb Aaron of Belz never saw Belz rebuilt, but his soul, his neshama saw. He saw in the eyes of his little nephew the remnant of the house of Belz. He saw in those eyes the spark of restoration, of rebuilding. And that's what it means. He entered with peace and he left with peace, because he never looked back. He only looked forward.